Joe Biden was just disconnected from this growing piece of the American public to such an extent that it made people feel hermetically removed from politics to the point that they just turned off and tuned out. Why the Kamala Harris phenomenon is happening is that it was this slingshot effect of people who had felt so cut off and all of a sudden now feel brought in.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by my co-host, the executive director of the Progress Network, Emma Varvaloucas. Drum roll, please. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast where we look at issues of the world with a lens of, yes, what could go right, and not just the continual question that people seem to ask of what's going wrong and what could go wrong. And in that light, we talk to a lot of different people with a lot of different sensibilities, because we do think there are a lot of different sensibilities that should be addressed, as long as it's with the generalized sensibility that I just talked about at the beginning. One of the places where that sensibility is least apparent and often least present is in political campaigns, and particularly in the United States during presidential election cycles, where the nastiest, most partisan divisions, the pettiest aspects of our collective and individual personas are given full flight and full expression in the bloom of social media that gives us all a megaphone, often for our worst instincts rather than for our better. So today we're going to talk to someone who has been reporting about politics, who has been at the center of the media universe, and is one of the most enlightened, interesting, eclectic, and diverse voices out there. So, Emma, who are we going to talk to today?
All right, so today we're talking to Evan Osnos. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's also a contributor on CNN and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's written 3 books, one of them being a book about Joe Biden called Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. And he's also the author of Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. So he's been in the news business a long time, and I'm looking forward to what he has to tell us about Trump, Kamala, Waltz, all the major players.
All right, let's talk to Evan. Evan Osnos, pleasure having you today. And while you are someone who has written widely, if not deeply, on a whole variety of topics, today I think we're going to focus a bit on the election and all that's going on in that, because that happens to be one of your foci right now. I think any interview that has the word foci at least once in it is probably already a success. So we've gotten that out of the way. I'm going to ask a question that I'm not even sure I'm that interested in, but I think it's worth asking because it seems to be unasked, which is, for all the enthusiasm that is now directed, interestingly, compellingly in the direction of Kamala Harris, Joe Biden is still president of the United States, which seems to have become at the very least an afterthought. And I guess I'm just wondering, what does Biden do as president for the next X months? I mean, second-term presidents always have this kind of lame duck quality come about now at the end of a second term. So in that sense, he's almost, I guess, like that. But it seems even lamer than the normal lame duck. So I'm just wondering, given that you've been following Biden for a long time and have some thoughts about this, what is his presidency actually for the next, between now and January, whatever the date is?
Yeah, I mean, he's in a really unusual position for all obvious reasons. I mean, we just haven't had something like this. And he's been acutely conscious of this risk, not necessarily specifically the idea of dropping out of a presidential race with 100 days to go to election and so on. But I do remember when I was interviewing him once during the vice presidency back in 2014. And at that point, it was already a relevant question to ask. He was 71. And I said, when do you think you will retire? And his answer was interesting. He answered it by saying, I encouraged my father to retire. And I think it was a mistake, he said, because I think he could have continued working. And it was in its own way, looking back now, kind of a little window into his sense that there's something perilous about announcing an end date on your centrality. I mean, he's always believed this idea that, as he sometimes says, you're either on the way up or you're on the way down. And now, of course, he's in this strange purgatory in between. And that is an uncomfortable place, I think I can confidently describe. So I talked to somebody just a couple of days ago who's very close to him, who says, I guess I would put his frame of mind right now as disappointed but not depressed. And there's a lot there.
Well, I wonder if we could rewind a little bit, and maybe you can talk a bit about how you view his frame of mind when he did decide to make the decision, right? Like, did he see it as a legacy saver? Was he really convinced that he couldn't win? I mean, what's your take on it?
I get the sense that in the end, it was primarily a political judgment. And I think that is a reflection of some of his blind spots, to be honest, about himself, meaning that there came a point when the data was incontrovertible. And there's an argument to be made that there was data all along that should have been 5-alarm fire material inside their political operation. And for various reasons, it wasn't 5-alarm fire. I interviewed some of his advisors about how they thought about these negative polls. And they had made this very impassioned case that they didn't believe the conventional polling that was out there, which is wild considering that they were, of course, doing their own polling internally. So it was never clear to me why it was that they would believe some of their own indicators, but not public indicators. And I think it gets to some of the strange psychology of conviction that's required in order to be a candidate. But to your question, Emma, I think in the end, it was the recognition that he was going to lose and lose with great influence, meaning it would drag down Democrats across the Congress, which is a place that he cares about more than most presidents. And then wrapped up in that is, of course, your place in history. And he is acutely, probably in the end, to a fault, concerned about how he's perceived and how he's regarded and the need for approbation. So all of those things came together to produce this very unusual decision. I mean, it's worth just pausing to recognize how strange it is. And in its way, what a mercy and what a glory it was that he said, I'm out, as painful as that probably was for him personally.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by like how sudden and slow it all seemed in that until the day that he announced or released that letter, I guess on that Sunday. Even as that Friday, I guess his campaign had done another statement saying, we're all in, we're going ahead. I mean, it wasn't like it was more like a dam breaking at the end, or at least it felt that way. And then I'm still surprised. I read this interview, I think over the weekend with Anita Dunn, who had been one of his, for those who don't know, one of his kind of inner circle counselors. And she, I think recently just stepped down and gave a very sort of tone-deaf, truculent interview about how she felt this was all kind of unfair and he was dealt a raw hand and we should have been able to go on and he was fine. It was all fine. It was fine. He had a bad debate, big deal. I wonder what you feel about that, having been around a lot of politicos and that mindset in that, this was one of these cases where even before the debate, it just felt kind of palpably like a vast number of people had come to the conclusion that he was simply too old. Not that 81 or 82 is too old, just that Joe Biden was, right? It's like I don't even think there was a lot of ageism in that perception, or at least, I'm sure there was some, but it seemed much more like it didn't feel like this particular person could win this particular campaign or even should. And yet you had an inner circle that clearly had a completely different funhouse mirror thing. And like, how is that possible?
I think that part of this has to do with somewhat the difference between governing and campaigning, in the sense that, except on the edges right now, I would, and you may disagree, but I think people sort of broadly feel like, okay, this guy is capable of governing for the next 5 months, and but not in the end capable of campaigning and winning. And those are slightly, and that's because they are separate functions. And even people who are in disagreement with him about policy decisions, they will ultimately say, no, the guy is the one making the decisions, and he's making good faith, competent decisions. You may just disagree with them, but that's so in a way. The people who were most immediately around him in the White House, that was part of it. They were seeing not just him out on the stump looking extremely frail, and they were also seeing him, in a room, small group, details, that kind of thing. Now, I don't mean to ignore what is the elephant in the room, which is that there were people close to him who clearly decided at a certain point that they were just going to try to kind of muscle it out, that they thought that he could rise to the occasion when they needed him to. And that's a big piece of it, too, is that when he performed well at the State of the Union, that was, in a sense, an indication that he had this range, that there were days when he would be bad, and then there were days when he could rise to the occasion. And the fact that they pushed for there to be a debate, and this is Nancy Pelosi's view too, the fact that they pushed for a debate is a sign that they were not, that was not a suicide mission. They were not doing that because they thought he would get up there and take down their campaign. They were doing it because they thought that he could demonstrate that he could put these questions about competence and age to the side. And of course, that's not what happened. That was the unraveling, but it is a sign that it's not as if they were, this is where I think the idea that there was some vast government conspiracy at the top of the White House, Watergate of cognition that was, hiding his infirmity, is more of a fever dream on the right than it is an actual description of how it was experienced, I think, to the people who were involved with it.
It's also wild, too, now that everything doesn't hang on Biden, how the narrative has, instead of he's a decrepit old zombie, all of a sudden now he's really fresh and peppy and he's got spice and he's answering, reporters with these little zingers and things like that.
I'll tell you what, just an interesting little insight is, so there was a viral tweet a couple days ago in which the campaign had responded to that bizarre Donald Trump, Elon Musk interview in which they had technical problems. And anyway, the Harris campaign had put out a snarky, good rebuttal, and it went all over the place because people said, see, look at that. They've got their groove back. And oddly enough, I know the person in the campaign who wrote the tweet, and I said, that was a good tweet. And he said, yeah, the funny thing is I was writing tweets like that 6 months ago about Biden. It's just that nobody noticed or cared or thought they were funny. And and the reason why I think that's important is that it gets to this interesting thing that is a fact about politics, that the frame, the aspiration that we have, the perception we have really for a candidate is so important. And that the same language coming from two different people can be interpreted in such widely different ways. That's not a criticism. That's a statement of reality about politics, and you ignore it at your peril.
So what do you make, let's, shifting to the current dynamics, I've been surprised, maybe even occasionally really surprised at this Kamala surge. And I say this not with any particular, I thought Kamala vastly underwhelmed as vice president in 2021. I don't know if that was bad press, but at some point, bad press is a reflection of some reality. I don't think press kind of is a completely false overlay or lens. She was not overly impressive as a candidate. I met her in 2020. She was, interesting, fine, engaging, but this kind of surge over the past 3 weeks, it may be a lot of projection of a lot of people onto what amounts to something of a blank canvas, and that it's not like she has clear ideological policy positions. She may be more Clintonian in her ability to morph her positions to suit the political moment. But again, how do you account for this? Because it is rather extraordinary. And it also may be a lot of deflected energy of people who don't like Trump but had nowhere to put it, right? So there's a whole series of things, but I'm just curious as to your take.
Yeah, I think there are elements of everything there. One is this. There was an almost undescribed vast pool of energy, of enthusiasm waiting to be discovered. You've written about this recently, Zachary, and I do think it's a huge point that in a way, there was this sense of ennui, of malaise. Curiously, I was working on a long piece for The New Yorker for much of the summer about precisely this problem of disengagement and how it seemed like it was so profound. And I was looking at all of the literature, the psychology of apathy and of meaning, and why people had lost a sense of agency and of belonging and of autonomy and of affect and all of these things. And it was really it was this very gratifying model that was coming together. Okay, this is why we've got this problem. And then it turns out that actually, when you replace the person at the top, and this is the irony of it, is It's not as if the person at the top of the ticket was replaced in some great demonstration of democratic agency. In fact, it was done more or less in the kind of smoke-filled room way. That's not a criticism of it. It had to be done. That's why parties exist. But yet, it still ignited the feeling among the public, among this large portion of the public, that there was a responsiveness to the public will that had been absent. And that is some of what's happening here. And the reason why I think that's so interesting is that in a way, it wasn't as if people needed to be able to go into the booth, pull the lever, and change the top of the Democratic ticket. They just needed some demonstration that the candidate could be a closer reflection of them, their age, their ethnic diversity, their style, their humor. In so many ways, Joe Biden was just disconnected from this growing piece of the American public to such an extent that it made people feel hermetically removed from politics to the point that they just turned off and tuned out. That's what I think is part of what's going on.
This is your first moment where you could say, "Wow, like Joe Biden killed my piece."
Yes. Well, in a way, that's the natural order of the universe. But in some ways, I find myself now reading some of that stuff and thinking, actually, that's the substructure of a really interesting piece about why the Kamala Harris phenomenon is happening, is that it was this slingshot effect of people who had felt so cut off and all of a sudden now feel brought in. And I think it complicates in a really thrilling way how we sometimes imagine you have to find routes for public engagement. It turns out that there are other ways to do it.
So you think that all the kind of like internet energy that exists right now is really going to convert into real energy? Because I was gobsmacked the difference in social media after Kamala Harris essentially like got the nod. It was like on TikTok, just thing after thing after thing, about Kamala. Her campaign is obviously being run by Gen Z people on social media because they're totally in the zeitgeist. I was like, oh yeah, like I'm really feeling this in a way that I was totally not expecting. But then I was reading all of these kind of like doom and gloom takes about like, don't expect that to like really translate. That's a urban, coastal, whatever thing. And that's not going to speak to white working class voters. That's not going to speak to, X, Y, and Z. What do you think about that? Is it real? Is it not real?
I am just back from a week in the Midwest, and I was going to events in Michigan that she was doing. And there are white working class people who are also white working class Gen Z. And that's worth remembering, that there is, particularly in an election where we're talking about these very small margins, the difference between people engaging not just enough to go vote, but then also going and getting their neighbor or driving somebody down the block is a huge deal. I think at this point, it's a mug's game to start making predictions about what piece of the energy is going to exist until November, simply because this election has been effective in showing the limits of predictions. Even, on the very day that Biden dropped out, the number of donors who I was talking to who were saying, it can't be Kamala, it can't be Kamala. And within 24 hours, it was. But I think it's worth pointing out that in addition to the meme energy, which has been really visible and amazing, there's a much more conventional and behind the scenes dynamic that has gone on, which is that she was on the telephone, and more importantly, some of the people who are around her and advising her and working for her had been laying the foundation really since Dobbs to go and suddenly activate this network of people and supporters and people like, state party chairs, delegates to the DNC. These are not high profile public figures, but they are the middle management of big D Democratic Party and small d democracy. And they were vital in the process of her ending up with this. I mean, as somebody said to me the other day, who is not on her team, but is just an observer, they said, she wasn't given this job. She took it. Meaning the nomination is an important point.
Harris took the memes. She ran with them from the jump. What have you made of their social media strategy so far?
It's masterful, Alicia. I mean, the way that she is able to harness that earned media, really connecting with digital natives, that younger generation, but also not ignoring the old school paid side of things. You know, we have seen that in the last week, the Harris campaign spent close to 30 million, and they're going to be spending another 50 million coming up on the DNC. So they are really going hard on the social media campaign, which I think is fantastic, especially because she has time to make up for. That being said, Alicia, I worry there's that little Debbie Downer in me that sees the need for coupling that with old school politics. So just making sure that you're not relying on social media alone, because it is a fantastic buzz to convert votes, to convert especially young folks who are low propensity voters to A, register to vote, and then B, turn out and vote. So I mean, as long as they have that direct mobilization conversion piece, the social media is going to do what it needs to do.
There's an irony too, apropos Emma's point of, on the heels of Congress passing a bill and then Biden signing it that paves the way to ban TikTok because of pernicious Chinese influence, everybody is running in the Democratic Party right now saying absolutely nothing about TikTok as a negative thing, because all they want to do is use TikTok as a way of getting elected, which I have to say is one of the funnier. I don't know, like it's kind of absurd on the face of it, right? Like, we don't want the Chinese government spying on our lives, but let's just hold off on that and use this tool that the Chinese government may control to get ourselves elected.
Yeah,
I mean,
they were always in that contradiction too when it was Biden at the top of the ticket. I mean, they were using TikTok not particularly successfully, but that's sort of been a dynamic for a while.
So how does this go as a media person, right? I mean, as someone who understands it, in it, you're going to have this kind of continued wave of focus on Kamala through the Democratic convention, which basically means through Labor Day, right? And then Labor Day is going to be some weird reset point. And there is an adage in news, and certainly in a social media fueled news world, where an old story is an old story. So you need a news story. So the question is, like, I'm not asking for a prediction on how the election goes. I'm asking for your sensibility about, nobody sticks on the same story. So do you turn around, and is there going to be a natural inertia come Labor Day of like, we thought Kamala was amazing, but now maybe we don't think she's so amazing, or what? I guess I don't quite know where this goes. And the one thing that's particularly striking and particularly negative for Donald Trump's campaign is the one thing that he has thrived on is the negative attention of the kind of, the media elite that does indeed skew toward the Democrats. And he's lost that attention, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But I guess, where does it go in your view? Not the election, but the media narrative or the media energy. Well,
there is, and you already kind of see it in some of the coverage, this feeling that, when's the next beat of the story? And I find that kind of a little gross, the idea that people are waiting inevitably for, when does the Kamala balloon come crashing down? I'm saying that in quotation marks, because it's just this assumption. And this, you've thought a lot about this. There's a negativity bias in news that, in a sense, the very definition of news is the plane that crashes. And that in its way, this gets to a kind of, I think, a more interesting underlying conversation about how our information is absorbed and distributed. Is that was sort of, it made sense when news was a smaller portion of our daily lives. But when news, both for commercial reasons and for information distribution reasons, is now a constant infusion, a sort of trickle drip into our brains, if individual practitioners need to go out and find examples of a crashing plane all the time, that means that as the news user, that's what you're getting. Now, that's a roundabout way of saying that, there is this inevitable instinct to say, what would be the news story now? It would be that maybe the Kamala phenomenon is unsustainable. I don't know if it is sustainable. I have no idea. But I think going out and kind of assuming that it's doomed is part of this fascinating problem of news methodology that I can describe. And also, I'm in this industry. I know it. I know the reality of it. I guess, but the other thing that's happening, this is, there's been a really interesting critique I think, a very credible critique in the last couple of days from James Fallows, who, after all, is a longtime reporter, distinguished American journalist, has the credibility to point out problems in the industry. And, he made the observation that after that really disabled performance by Donald Trump in his conversation with Elon Musk, that's just the only way to put it. I mean, he was voicing the most bizarre, unhinged perceptions of reality, that there's been no front page coverage of that in that context in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal, the three major national newspapers. Of the kind, what he is saying is, why we're not seeing stories about Donald Trump, a geriatric candidate, and his declining cognitive capability? Why are we not seeing comparable stories of the kind we saw about Biden, about, insiders at the top of the Republican Party whispering about it? Why is it not a subject of constant dinner conversation? Why is it that we don't have, psychologists and medical practitioners being quoted on the front page of those papers saying, I can't diagnose him because I haven't examined him, but it appears to me that he shows the indications and symptoms of X, Y, and Z. It just hasn't existed. And so Fallows, to his great credit, I think, has been running this kind of daily, day 6, day 7, where are those front page stories kind of count. And I find that really worth paying attention to.
Well, the thing with Trump is that it's hard to separate cognitive decline from his general unhingedness that has been around since he kind of came onto the political scene. So I guess that's one defense of the media here.
I guess, no, but I agree with you, Emma. I mean, I think that's certainly the explanation, that we've all just kind of been like, oh, well, that's the base case. But if that's the base case, then it has to be described and announced every day that the Republican nominee is operating from a continuous condition of cognitive dysfunction. Why is that not still front page news? This gets to this. This is why I brought up this point about essentially the sort of definitional problem of news. It's the new thing. But you could even confine it and say, all right, he's demonstrating new evidence of his declining capability. So anyway, that's my pitch for the Fallows view. I find it very compelling.
One thing I was going to add to that before was when you're talking about this inevitable energy of it's not going to last, I feel like a lot of us are so used to the worst occurring that the idea that maybe the worst is not going to occur now feels really foreign and a little bit psychologically dangerous to latch onto.
Yeah, that's a super interesting phenomenon. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think my wife and I were talking about the other day about how this feels different or similar to the Obama phenomenon in 2008. And one of the things that seems really apparent is we're hardened as a people. We're sort of tempered a bit by the reality of history that zigs and zags and can sometimes punch you in the face. And it's like we're just not as open to the possibility of good news, perhaps, in the way that we were 16 years ago. I mean, 16 years is a very long time in this day and age. I think this gets to an interesting question, which is, has it changed us for good or for worse in terms of our capacity to imagine good outcomes? I mean, obviously, it's at the core of what you guys think about, but I think about this a lot, this puzzle of how is it possible to be optimistic and not naive? How is it possible to be ambitious and not cynical? How is it to be cool without being dopey? These are all questions that are at the center of the daily news proposition, because the cool points accrue to the person who's willing to say, oh, it's all doom and gloom coming. And I don't think that's a healthy way to live. And it's also probably doesn't match onto reality.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways in which I've tried over the past 8 years of thinking about this and in whatever way communicating it, which I think has largely failed, which is my cohort, right? Elite, educated, urban, likely Democratic, has failed to separate in the Donald Trump era the candidate from the party and the party from its voters, and has sort of mishmashed everything into one global emanation of Donald Trumpism, which is tempting, right? Because there's certainly evidence of that, if that's what you want to find, if that's the prism that you want to see reality through. But it's unequivocally true that, there vast numbers of people will vote for Donald Trump in November, feeling much the way about Donald Trump that most people appear to feel about Donald Trump, that he's like a narcissistic, not nice guy who you wouldn't want either marrying your daughter, being your friend, leading your business, teaching your children, leading the country, having the button, anything of all of that. But he's the choice you've got compared to the other choice you've got. And the other choice you got is laden with a huge amount of baggage. If you are, if you talk to someone like Elise Slotkin, who's a congressional representative of Michigan running for Michigan Senate, she kind of gets this and has gotten this all along. Like, there's a lot of people who feel that the Democratic Party and the Republican establishment have let them down in a whole myriad of ways, many of which, honestly, if you were them, is quite accurate, right? It's not a line they've been told. It's not a what's the matter with Kansas narrative. It's like, they've gotten screwed in a whole series of ways that it could have gone elsewhere.
Yeah.
I hope that changes, but do you see any evidence of, like, in the media world of, like, trying to look at these realities? Because no matter what, this is likely to be a close election. I guess Kamala could develop intense momentum, and whatever the Trump balloon is could deflate, and it could not be. But from the moment, it would appear it is likely to be close.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be brutally close. I looked at one sustained example of this question of why people have turned away from the Democratic Party and sort of what are the real reasons and what are the fake reasons. I was looking at West Virginia because that's where my first job was out of college, and I've kind of been in and out of there over the years. And I do find that there's a couple of interesting examples. That one is sort of the credible reason. The credible reason for turning away from Democrats, and for people who have forgotten this, is West Virginia, when I was starting out of college, was all Democrats. The congressional delegation was all Democrats. It was, you would literally go into people's homes and find portraits of FDR on the wall. And that was because West Virginia benefited greatly from the New Deal and from what Roosevelt did for labor protections and things like that. Then, amazingly, it has flipped to some of the most reliable Republican territory. And part of the reason was because it just fell off the radar screen of the Democratic Party. That is one of the explanations. The most sort of evocative example of this, which I do think of often, is that in the town where I work, Clarksburg, West Virginia, during the 1960 presidential Democratic primary, which is this very memorable occasion because that's the primary that proved that John F. Kennedy could conceivably be the Democratic nominee because he could be nominated by Protestants. But in that year, so many major Democratic heavyweights came to little Clarksburg, West Virginia, a town of 15,000 people. JFK came multiple times, Bobby Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, you go down the list, Lyndon Johnson. Just one after other. Kennedy went on TV in this town and gave a 30-minute sort of call-in Q&A with people. So there was a level of engagement. To go back to this thing we were talking about earlier, people felt some agency, some proximity, some attachment to what the party was doing. It didn't feel remote. It didn't feel elite. It didn't feel far away. And then I was talking to people at the Historical Society in Clarksburg. I said, so give me the list of the other Democratic presidential nominees who have visited since 1960. And they went back into the archives and came back and they were like, well, none. They said Jesse Jackson came once in 1988. That's as close as we've come. And so that's the real kind of, they fell off the radar screen of what the Democratic Party represented as it shifted to focusing more on urban areas. But then there's a completely hallucinatory version of why the Democratic Party should be rejected by voters in places like West Virginia. And that's this idea that was propagated very effectively by right-wing propagandists starting back in about 1999 and 2000. Really, it was sort of, Karl Rove found something very effective, which is he said, Democrats hate coal. West Virginia loves coal. Therefore, West Virginia must hate Democrats. And he just sort of started turning that idea very effectively, found local people who would become the spokespeople for that idea. And by the time you get to sort of, and I'll wrap up this little soliloquy in a second by saying that by the time you get to like 2000, and by the way, 2000 was a pivotal year because had Al Gore won West Virginia, he would have won the presidency, even without Florida, worth remembering. By the time you get to like 2013, 14, there is this universal perception, more or less universal perception that in West Virginia that the Democrats are seeking to, quote unquote, destroy my way of life, meaning the coal industry, which that is the life spring for local commerce, for culture, for status. That's what allows a person to be a big wheel in the community, is having a reliable job and union benefits and so on. But so eventually that just becomes so much of a feeling of an existential threat. Then there's all the social permission that goes along with the idea of voting, of not voting for Democrats, and you're off to the races. So that's a really, I'm sorry, long way of answering the question, but I do think there's an element of, there's a real thing and there's a fake thing, and you have to sort of identify both.
And J.D. Vance kind of embodies both.
Yeah.
Right? Same area, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio.
Yeah, but I will also say Tim Walz does too. And that's the cool thing. I find that a really fascinating comparison. I mean, Tim Walz is basically what J.D. Vance pretends to be. I'll stand by that. That's like, I think a really, that's an essential truth. And I for one am really looking forward to the vice presidential debate, because Tim Walz has a pretty crystalline understanding of what people care about right now in rural communities in the upper Midwest. And if you want to ask people in Appalachia about what they think of Hillbilly Elegy, you actually don't need to go door to door. You can read a book that was the rebuttal to it called Appalachian Reckoning, written by a bunch of writers, basically saying this is not us.
Yeah, I mean, the fast and deep unpopularity of J.D. Vance is also fascinating, right? Like, just people from the vast spectrum of American society that I know, like, all dislike him, which is really, it's a feat, right? To be disliked that badly, that fast. Forgive me for asking this question, but do you think that Trump really does have cognitive decline? Because I know that there's been a lot of like, okay, Trump picked Vance because he was reacting to the Biden campaign. He felt really sure that he was going to win. And now he's not, he was caught flat-footed. Now he can't react that fast to the Harris campaign. But like, this is Trump. I mean, like, it surprises me that he's kind of making these really poor marketing moves, because at the core, like, he's great at selling stuff, right?
I mean, this is a question. Like, this gets to this, do you think that he actually believes that Kamala Harris AI'd her crowd in Detroit? Right. And of course, the savvy answer is to say, well, no, he's just doing that because he's trying to fool his public and sort of lead them down this path. And then he also talks about it on his Elon Musk interview. And like, on some level, you begin to lose that, what used to be this very canny distinction that he was able to play between which part of his public dialogue was the fake wrestling and which part was the real wrestling. And like, that was always at the core. I think you're onto something very important, Emma, which is that, like, we do tend to assume that when he does something that is by any reasonable definition the utterance of a crazy person, that we just chalk it up to some marketing triple play. And I don't know. At a certain point, kings do go mad. And I am not answering the question deliberately because I don't know. And this is what I've always thought, it's always funny when reporters say, well, according to the studies of his vocabulary, you see more limited use of words. Like, yeah, I can cite those same sorts of indicators. But in the end, we sort of kind of go with our gut. On some level, Americans looked at Joe Biden and decided on some almost just sort of biological, interpretive level, this person is diminished. And there was something to that. And I think it's hard not to look at Donald Trump and not decide some similar things. But that's not my job. And I'm not trained to do it. Now, I'm doing, of course, a Trumpy thing, which is I'm saying I'm not saying something by saying it, but I'll leave it there.
Some
it was
people
an irresponsible
say
question.
that Trump is undergoing cognitive decline. I mean, I'm just saying some people say that.
Fair enough.
So what are you going to focus on for the next? Is this going to be your bailiwick for the next 3 months? I mean, you've had you kind of toggle between over the past years the political focus, and you did the extraordinary Biden biography at an extraordinary time. But you've also focused a lot on China. You focused a lot on American culture. You focused a lot on kind of the quirky oddity of the lifestyles of the rich and famous and how they are deeply. It's like another culture sociologically. So what's your focus for the next few months?
Well, I am keeping my eye pretty closely on the presidential race. And partly that's because there are ways of writing about a lot of those elements through the lens of presidential politics. And I'm going to do that. I'm not planning to go to China between now and the election. But I was there last fall, for instance, sort of knowing that we were about to get into the presidential cycle. And part of the reason I did a long piece in the New Yorker about the mood in China called The Age of Malaise. And that's partly because I was trying to understand, in a sense, how does it feel there compared to how we were feeling here? And this circles back to something we talked about earlier, which is this, all of a sudden we went from being this country that was totally apathetic to being this country that feels hyper engaged. And I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, I'm describing mostly a phenomenon on the Democratic side of the ledger, but that's kind of interesting. And as a comparison to China, you know, they don't have those moments of swings from apathy to engagement or of feeling of powerlessness to powerful, partly because the political system doesn't allow it. Political system is so top down and sclerotic right now that you don't get that. So anyway, I'm kind of for the moment, I'm oscillating and staying in that one place of looking at the U.S. for the next few months.
Although on the China point, you could argue that there was an intense amount of popular passion, and this is our moment, and this is the ascendancy of a new China in the 21st century that was palpable and real in 2010 that Xi Jinping has managed for his own particular worldview to totally damp down.
Agree. Yeah.
You know, it doesn't manifest itself politically, but it certainly manifested itself culturally.
Totally agree. I mean, I think it really was this extraordinary moment of awakened individual aspiration and then collective aspiration. That was the dominant sensibility in the years that I was living there, 2005 to 2013. And that's what's so striking now is that, and there's a way to think of it, which is that Xi Jinping basically demoralized the society in three different stages. The first one was the political stage when he began to purge the party of his rivals and so on. And then the second stage was when he demoralized the business community, the sort of entrepreneurial class by locking up somebody like, you know, you go down the list. There's a whole range of them. But Jack Ma would be the most prominent example of somebody whose wings were clipped, and that sent out the message to everybody. And then the third stage was the public during the zero COVID period, particularly in a place like Shanghai, where all of a sudden you had people who were these were fully realized autonomous individuals. That's how they thought of themselves. And then they discovered that no matter how successful I had been in my personal and my business life, that the government could come and say, I'm literally going to lock you in your house for 2 months. I mean, that is a real fact. That was for people, this is not melodramatic, it was traumatizing. And it ultimately led them to sort of think about plan B. And that's why people were moving money abroad or moving themselves abroad. And so that's a level of disengagement that is really a profound difference from where it was 10 years ago.
Evan, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. It's the kind of thing we could go on for hours, which I would love if I were Joe Rogan. But otherwise, we're going to keep this at a more reasonable length. Maybe we'll revisit all this on the other side of November and see what the world looks like. I think this is all reminder, particularly the past weeks and the writing that you've done of, and interesting that we ended with the China point of, we all get very caught in our present moment and have a tendency, I think, to extrapolate that our present is just reality. And it is our present reality. But as you've just talked about, whether it's China, whether it's the United States before July, things can just change on a dime in ways that are palpable and intense. And no, we don't always expect them, because if we expected them, it wouldn't be a surprise. But we shouldn't be surprised by how quickly things can go from one extreme to another culturally, even as it feels in the moment impossible. And you've certainly been highlighting a lot of the warp and woof of so many things, and have been an incredible voice that I always read and always look forward to, and I certainly encourage everyone else to. So go about your day, go report on the campaign or whichever campaign, and we will talk to you again.
Great to be with you guys. Talk to you on the other side.
I don't have much more to say other than what I said at the end, which is that's the kind of conversation. I mean, look, I feel we say this over and over and over again in the enthusiasm for the particular conversation, but I do feel it this time as well. Just, he's such a interesting person, modest in affect and brilliant behind it. And I kind of wish there were more Evan Osnoses at the heart of the media world. He's so uninterested in the kind of gotcha journalism. He's so uninterested in undermining for the sake of a good story, but also tough. It's like it's a great combination in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to meet those people that have been in the news industry for a really long time and come out of it with the takeaways, the James Fallow-esque takeaways that are, he had absolutely no hesitation being like, I just think it's kind of gross for the media to be like, what's the next thing? Whereas, when you are tracking news on the day to day, like you do feel this little like, let me get it, and it's definitely a credit to him that he notices it, resists it.
Yeah. And also James Fallow, who's one of the original members of the Progress Network, also, has embodied some of the work he did with his wife, Our Towns, looking partly at West Virginia and how they have people at the grassroots have kind of tried to remake themselves, not in angry J.D. Vance fashion, but in much more uplifting, I guess, Tim Walz fashion. So people should check that out as well. But it's going to be, I still think what's interesting is for the first time, this possibility in the campaign that some of the Trump bubble actually does deflate and this doesn't end up a close election, which I think is unlikely. But of course, if you'd asked me or anyone a few months ago, I would have thought that was impossible, right? Now I think it's unlikely, but I think there is actually a possibility that this ends up much less close than we expect. And that would have been unthinkable even a year ago. So that's intriguing as well. And something we should, I think, contemplate as possible, because momentum can, in fact, build on itself as opposed to be reversed.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that has been surprising so far, in addition to the very surprising thing of Biden actually stepping down, is that everyone kind of assumed that if Harris stepped in, everyone would hate her. I think that's also one of the reasons why we're having this feeling of like, is it going to last? Or is she going to, continue to build momentum? Or are people going to revert to their original Harris stances, right? I think we're going to have a big clue. Yeah. This is going to be after this podcast comes out, but she's going to be announcing some of her policy positions, or she already did. So we can't talk about them now, but I think that'll also be a good indicator about how people react to those.
Absolutely. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Emma, once again for co-hosting, and we will see you all on the other side.
Thanks, Zachary, and thanks, everyone.